Toro Rosso. Now, man, was this an interesting season. 7th place overall, 63 points overall. They also had 3 drivers for the year. They started out with Carlos Sainz and Max Verstappen, but as we quickly found out, Verstappen was swapped with Kvyat, and Kvyat, I think it's fair to say Toro Rosso got the raw end of that deal, getting Daniel Kvyat back, and
not just Daniel Kvyat, a trashed Daniel Kvyat, because basically he was hung out to dry in front of the world.
As my microphone drops off my stand there, that's not a good look.
Your microphone just summed up Daniel Kvyat's season.
Pretty much, it was doing its best Kvyat impression by just jumping off the side of my ledge.
It was a metaphor for a season.
Yeah, clearly my microphone was onto something there. But it's hard to describe Toro Rosso season because, Toro Rosso had a problem from the start, and the problem was that they had a Ferrari power unit that they couldn't upgrade because it was last year's Ferrari power unit. So they were effectively dangling by a noose from the start, where it was only going to get worse as the year went on, and I was going to say it kind of showed, but it's impossible to talk about Toro Rosso and not talk about just how friggin' awesome Carlos Sainz was this season.
Because Carlos Sainz made it work.
Carlos Sainz.
Well, I was going to. My notes for Toro Rosso basically says they ended up being the definition of average. But they were doing what they were there to do ultimately, which was keep the Red Bull reserves under their umbrella. That's exactly what they did with Kvyat. They were a place to keep him in the Red Bull umbrella, but they didn't want him in the main team anymore because Max. But it would have gone to plan as well, except that Sainz clearly had ideas above his station. That kid was sensational. Or he was one of those guys where it's like, again, the results probably do and don't tell the full story, because I remember the story of back at the Spanish Grand Prix. Of course, there was only one Red Bull driver that everyone was talking about. But didn't Sainz finish 6th that day? Or 5th?
He did. He finished 6th. It was his joint best result of the year. 6th place in Catalonia, home race. And
it feels to me like Sainz is almost like Red Bull's version of Nico Rosberg. Now, stick with me on this one, in that he has always been in the shadow of more notable and famous project drivers, if you will. He was obviously in the shadow of Max Verstappen last year. They were the 2 famous young rookies. And then obviously the story was around Daniil Kvyat. But the whole time, Sainz has just got on with it and been quietly very good. Like, he was all of Verstappen's equal last year, I think.
I completely agree. And
he was, he's not the sexy pick in terms of, we know Verstappen's such an explosive character all round anyway, but Sainz is just there. He could be a superb franchise player on the level of like a Grosjean or a Hülkenberg or a Perez, but better. A guy who, I'm not denigrating those guys, but a guy who goes on to the big teams and gets the big results. Do you know what I mean?
Absolutely, and 8 out of the first 11 races, Carlos Sainz finished in the points. And you can't ask much more than that. As the team got worse, 2 6th place finishes at the end of the season at Cota and at Brazil. And that could have very well been a podium for Carlos if it wasn't for the fact he was on the wrong strategy towards the end of that Grand Prix. But it was still a tremendous performance from Carlos Sainz on that day. And Sainz was that standout midfielder, I think, more than anybody else this season, that for me was like, why aren't we talking about this guy more? And I'm glad as the season went on, there was more and more acknowledgement for the job that Carlos Sainz was doing. It was a far professional job. And
it's a big compliment now that in the Mercedes replacement driver rumours, his name is now being thrown into the ring, to the point that Christian Horner has had to say, again, hands off. Because wasn't it Renault who was interested in his services?
Yep.
Renault wanted him earlier in the year. We made a video about
2 at the factories that have been sniffing around Carlos Sainz. That's a big compliment.
It is a big compliment.
Although you've got to start to think, if you're Carlos yourself, how much longer do you want to stay in the queue behind Ricciardo and Verstappen and potentially another superstar behind you that you haven't even heard of yet, when you are now being scouted by the top teams in the sport?
Indeed.
I'd be at my desk looking for my Red Bull contract and looking for a lighter.
Indeed. I couldn't agree more. And it's one of those things where, like, Carlos Sainz, for a quick betting tip here, he was 28-1 for the Mercedes seat before they stopped taking bets. Towards yesterday, the last day they were taking bets on that market, for now at least, Carlos Sainz was slashed to 9-1 to take that seat behind the big 2 of Pascal Wehrlein and Valtteri Bottas. So people are starting to put more and more money down on Carlos Sainz for that seat, because I think people are starting to realise, wait, this guy is really good too. It may not be as exciting as Max Verstappen, but the kid's a brilliant talent, and certainly want to keep an eye on for next season as well, for Toro Rosso, because they are going back to Renault next season. So that is going to be intriguing to see if Renault and upgraded units can keep Toro Rosso in that kind of knocking on the door of semi-regular points kind of level. I mean, Kvyat, Toro Rosso's keeping him on for next year. Would anybody really have drawn much foul if they had let him go, given what has happened to him this season? And
I felt like his season was almost a wash. When you've been hung out to dry that badly in front of the F1 world, it just felt like he was damaged goods from there on in. So it's at least a nice show of respect from Red Bull in terms of, no, we still see something in this kid that they tried to keep him on. Or was it more a selfish case of he could do more damage to us outside of this organisation than in? Do you know what I mean? And you got to feel for Kvyat, because he was a scapegoat just for Verstappen. Like, if Jos hasn't thrown that tantrum and said that there was, like, I think he said there was some interest from Mercedes or something, then, like, Kvyat on pure performance wasn't getting out of that seat anytime soon. He was all right. He'd already got a podium in the first few races of the year, but he was collateral damage in the Verstappen saga, and it said a lot that it was at Singapore when we finally started to see some more aggro from Kvyat, and he was smiling getting out the car again. It was like, that had been a tough year for him, so I'm glad he's been kept on, and I think next year is going to be important for him because he won't have any excuse of having his confidence so badly dented.
Yeah, it's a make or break season without question, and again, like, Toro Rosso did great. Given the circumstances, given the fact that they were already shackled into a bad power unit, and they still finished a solid 7th overall, a distant 7th from everybody else, and very nearly were catching up to the back of McLaren Honda towards the end of the year. That 5th place that Fernando got at COTA, which we'll talk about in a minute, was probably more important than we realised at the time. But for me, purely because of Carlos Sainz, I'm going to say 7 for Toro Rosso, because I think Toro Rosso, we don't expect them to be good given the circumstances anyway, and Carlos Sainz made them good. And for that alone, I think deserves an extra point of credit. So, yeah, 7.
Yeah, I was going to go a little bit harsher on them and say 6, but Sainz is the asterisk by that 6. You know what I mean?
When a driver for your team has had a top 5 level season, I think it's hard not to give the team a little bit of extra credit where that's concerned.
Yeah, no, I won't disagree with that at all.
So, yeah, that's